My name is Philip, and I'm the pastor here. If you're a guest or you just woke up late and didn't want to go to your church because you're embarrassed, so you came here, we're glad that you're here. Just kidding, sort of. It is second service high attendance Sunday, in case you didn't know that. This is what happens every spring forward. That's what we call it. And so today is no stranger. We have higher attendance in the second service than we did first service today, which is unusual for us. But we are glad that you're here because it's actually not raining maybe right now for like 5 minutes. So you could be out there enjoying the not rain. This is the end of a series. So if you are coming here for the first time or you haven't been in a while, this is the end of a series that we've been in all year, as a matter of fact. This is week 9 of our series. We took a week off for Kingdom Weekend, and I'm sad to see it go. It's been an encouraging series for me. It's been a challenging series for me as we walked through these stories, walked through the Old Testament together, looking at how these stories point to a bigger story. And last week, if you were here last week and you came back this week, it's kind of a surprise because last week's sermon was so brutal. In case you weren't with us, you should go back and watch how I just called our entire church a whore. That was fun. So you'll have to go. Now you'll have to go to our YouTube page to find out if your curiosity is piqued. But today I get to talk about one of my favorite characters in all of Scripture. As a matter of fact, it's my favorite book of the Bible. It's the story of Nehemiah. And if you are not familiar with the story of Nehemiah, which a lot of people aren't, it's incredible, and you should. This is one of the stories you should read. This is an incredibly amazing story, and God used it to really shape my life. I'd never heard of Nehemiah other than trying to recite the books of the Bible at some point in Sunday school growing up, and I'd never read the story of Nehemiah until I was at that awkward after college, not quite feeling like an adult phase of life. You know, where you feel like you're supposed to have everything planned out, but then you don't have anything planned out, and then you feel judged by everyone in the world. Anybody at that? Yeah. We got some hankies last service for that. But that's where I was, and I had worked at a church some, and I'd been in ministry some, and I'd been a part of this worship band. Thankfully, not playing drums because that wouldn't have lasted long. But I had been a part of this worship band. We traveled to Southeast a little bit, and we were trying to decide, should we move to this place to really kind of go for that in ministry, or should I do this? And somebody encouraged me to read a book called Visioneering by Andy Stanley. I had no idea. It sounded weird. What is visioneering? It's a made-up word. But essentially, it's a story of Nehemiah. And the way the book worked was it was a chapter at a time, and at the end of each chapter, it would ask you some kind of introspective questions about what was taught in this chapter and then how it relates to your life. And through that book, studying Nehemiah and answering those questions, God revealed that he wanted me to pour my life into the local church. And that was it. I haven't looked back since. As many difficult bumps in the road as we've faced as a family, as many difficult situations that I've created for myself in ministry, I can't do anything other than pour my life in the local church. I love this, and I hope that this is the last job I ever have to look for. It's the longest job I've ever had, which doesn't say a lot that our church is only 4.5 years old, but I love it, and I love being your pastor. It's the privilege of my lifetime, but it's stressful at times. People had talked about how difficult it can be to pastor, how difficult it can be to church plant, and I didn't really understand it for the first few years. Now I'm starting to understand it. I'm starting to get the stress that comes with being a pastor. And to be quite honest, it's not the stress that the people put on me. It's the stress I put on myself. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later, but what I want you to hear, first off, is that first service, this sermon went in a very, very different direction than I expected it to. So I'm not really sure where we're going to go together. So just buckle up. This could be a wild ride. But we're going to jump into the story of Nehemiah. And for those of you who don't know who Nehemiah is, he was a Hebrew person, a Jewish person who was born in captivity. If you know the story at all, if you've been with us for the last couple of weeks, you know that at different points in the history of Israel, that these kingdoms would come in and they would take over the city of Jerusalem, they'd take over the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, and they would exile the best of the best out to their cities to try and build these empires. It was a really, really smart plan. They would take the best, they would acclimatize them to their culture, and then the best of every culture they conquered would become that culture. Well, in this circumstance, Nehemiah is actually born in captivity, in exile, and he is under Persian rule. And there's a couple of different directions on this. The timeline can get a little fuzzy, but in Scripture it says that he was the cupbearer to Artaxerxes. And some people think that was Esther's husband. Some people think it was the son of Esther's husband, but the point is that he was in a position of proximity to power. This lowly exile, born in exile Jewish guy was cupbearer to the king. Now, if you don't know what a cupbearer is, it's kind of an important job. It's the guy who gets poisoned before the king gets poisoned if someone's trying to poison the king. So a lot of trust, a lot of proximity, a lot of time spent in the palace with the king. That's who Nehemiah is. But Nehemiah is not satisfied with just being in the palace. He has this strong draw to his background, his background both with his family heritage, but also his religious background in being a Jew. And so there's a group that comes from Jerusalem that had been visiting in Jerusalem, and they come and he meets up with them and he's like, hey, how are things back in Jerusalem? And remember, for the Jewish people, the city of Jerusalem was kind of it. Like the temple was it, and it was the place and presence of God, and it mattered a whole lot. The physical place mattered tremendously to them. And so Nehemiah wanted to know, how are things? And this is what they said to him in chapter 1 of Nehemiah. We're going to put this on the screen. If you don't have a Bible, we'd love for you to turn there so you know where in the world Nehemiah is in the Bible. But in chapter 1, starting in verse 3, this is Nehemiah speaking. And they said to me, the remnant is the people who are left in Jerusalem, the people who have not been exiled, the people who have survived all these battles, the remnant of people who are there in Jerusalem. The remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire. Now, I want you to see specifically Nehemiah's response to this news, because it's different than how you and I probably would respond to news of that sort in our world. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. I had a rough couple of weeks, personally, and for weird reasons. If you're new to our church, I'm transparent to a fault, and it can get awkward, so sorry. 2 weeks ago, my wife and I, we found ourselves just kind of fighting in an edgy way that is unusual for us. Like, we're loud, we're Irish, it happens, right? So, but this was different. This is different than just annoyance. This was a grating, edgy ugliness that we found ourselves just coming back to 2 or 3 times in a week. And I was trying to figure out, what I did wrong, honestly. But I was looking at the circumstances, and for us, usually the stress level rises as our bank account level goes down, right? Most people, normal, right? And that's usually a trigger for us. And I know you young college students, you love the word trigger. So that's a trigger for us. And here's the thing. Our friends in D.C. had finally paid us back for that interest-free loan we gave them all year last year. And so there was actually money in the bank. And so money in the bank, kids were healthy. Both cars were actually working at the same time. And so we're like, what? Why? What is going on? There's no reason for us to be at each other's throats like this. And I finally realized after spending some time praying and reading and talking that, I don't know, this is going to sound super churchy. And if you're not a Christian, this is going to sound so weird. But I'm glad that you're here, and just bear with me for a moment, because I am a Christian, and I do believe these things happen. I believe we were under spiritual attack. I believe there was spiritual warfare going on, and the enemy was trying to take us down, and the only place that he could see to really divide us was in my marriage. And so he was trying to put stress on our relationship over stupid stuff. I mean, just dumb stuff. And this is like right before small group one week. Like, I'm getting the vacuum out, and I'm mad, and I'm yelling and screaming. I'm throwing the chair, like, we got to have small group and pray with our friends at church. Just really dumb stuff. And so finally, it hit me. This is spiritual warfare. And so Anita and I had this conversation out in the garage. And we've been prepared for that attack now, and it's been a lot better. But this past week, something changed. And we've been fighting the flu and all that kind of stuff like everybody else. But Monday of this past week, I felt like everything was everybody was healthy. I'm going to get some stuff done. I'm going to be like a real pastor this week and go see some people and do stuff. And then just something started to hit me. And it was like a cold, but it wasn't a full cold, and I was taking medicines. And then Tuesday, I was working, and my head just kind of went loopy, unusually loopy. I know I'm a little crazy in general, but but like physically feeling loopy to the point where I had to go home and I had to lay down, which is super unusual for me. And I was just, it was not okay. And the rest of the week, the only word that I could come up with to explain how I felt was melancholy, like just down. And I couldn't explain why. And the only thing I have to explain is that I feel like I was under some spiritual warfare. And so we shared all this kind of stuff with our small group and asked them to pray for us. And that has not completely subsided. But through all of that, I recognize that my response to the world that I live in, it's not normal. It's not what we find in Scripture. Because when I look at this and I see Nehemiah heard this bad news and he was troubled and he wept, his response wasn't to just, throw his hands up in the air. He went to what he had been doing consistently, which is fasting and praying. And listen, if you aren't a church person, then this is going to even sound weirder. But the church, we're supposed to be praying and fasting. And if you don't know what fasting is, maybe you've only heard of it because of a diet or something, which is a terrible diet to do. Don't do that. Fasting is a spiritual practice of removing things from our life, most usually food, so that we lean in on God's provision in our lives. Sometimes we can take that food time and devote it to biblical reading and prayer time. Sometimes we can take the money we would spend on meals and give it to mission. But the point of fasting is to clear our minds of the temporary and physical needs we feel like we have and trust God to provide and carry us in the midst of that. Fasting is all but completely gone from the modern American church. We don't practice it. It's not a normal part of our lives. My guess is that most of you have never done it in a spiritual context. But this is a regular part of Nehemiah's life. It's so regular that he leans on it when he gets bad news. Nehemiah isn't able to just pray and fast and then put a happy face on. As a matter of fact, his job is in the way, and he's in a job, like I said, where he has to go in the presence of the king on a regular basis, and if the king doesn't like your attitude, he can just kill you. He's the king, he can do what he wants. And so this particular day, Nehemiah walks in, and he's got kind of a sad face. He's kind of melancholy. He's kind of depressed and anxious about what's going on in Jerusalem. And the king notices it, and he says, dude, what's the deal? You're not sick. This must be sadness of the heart. Tell me what's going on in your life. And Nehemiah just starts to unload what's going on in his world, which is dangerous. You ever had that friend where you're like, hey, how you doing? And then you weren't prepared for the barrage of information you just got, And sometimes that turns out really, really good because they haven't told anybody and you can finally be there for them. Other times you're like, I just said hi. I don't have time for this, right? But Nehemiah does, and he does it in a way that's really unusual because the king looks at him and he says, what do you want me to do about it? What do you want me to do about the city of your fathers, the city of the graves of your fathers? What do you expect from me? And Nehemiah tells him exactly what he wanted to do. He had a plan because part of his prayer and fasting was also preparation for the opportunity that God might provide one day. If God answered your prayer, would you have a plan for how to move forward? Whatever that prayer is. One of our big prayers as a church for the last 4.5 years has been a building, right? And there's always buildings that we're looking at. There's a building I put on Insta story and Instagram and all the face spaces and all that stuff this week because I thought, you know what? We might as well pray about something. Who knows what God might do? If somebody came to me today and said, hey, I've got 8,000 square feet of warehouse space. Could you use that? I could use that. I have a plan. I know exactly the next 4 people I'm getting on the phone to talk about what we're doing. I know exactly how I'm going to divide that space up regardless of the shape of the building. I'm prepared for that. Now, if someone came to me and said, hey, we want your daughter to go to this college, and it's going to cost X amount of dollars, so we want her there, I have no plan for that. My plan is, I'm a church planter. Is there a scholarship for that? Or no? And so there are things in our lives that we're just not prepared that if God moves, that we're ready to move. If you use up all your vacation and all of a sudden God presents a missions opportunity, then you can't take it because you weren't prepared because you wanted to stay home from work an extra couple of days. Or you can't afford the mission trip because you've been spending money on that brand new TV. I'm not knocking your TV. I want to come and watch games on your TV. I enjoy it. But how are we preparing for how God might answer the prayers and then step back from that and like, are we asking God? Are we spending time in prayer with him? So Nehemiah says to the king, I want you to send me to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls, and I want you to pay for it. And then Nehemiah is beheaded. I'm just kidding. So you don't know the story of Nehemiah, do you? The king says yes. He sends him to Jerusalem with all the money he needs, with the papers that he needs to get through the different provinces. He sends him with an army of protection along the route, and he puts him in charge. Now, Nehemiah is a smart leader in the fact that he just doesn't walk in and say, all right, everybody, pick up a shovel, let's get to work. Because when a new guy comes into the office and he starts pretending or acting like he's the boss, even if he is the boss, nobody wants to see him as the boss, right? So what Nehemiah does is he goes to Jerusalem. In the middle of the night, he wakes up and he goes and inspects the walls to see exactly what he had heard was true. And he creates a plan. And he gathers the people together and says, here, this is how it needs to happen. This is what we need to do to get the job done. And he delegates the work out to people based on where they lived in relation to the wall. So people had a built-in desire to fix the wall near where they lived because that was protection for them. It wasn't just this big overarching goal to see the wall rebuilt. It was actually self-preservation in action, along with the overarching collective goal of the group. But there are people in the region who didn't want to see Jerusalem rebuilt. There's a guy named Sanballat, and there's another guy named Tobiah, and they were enjoying the fact that Jerusalem was in shambles. They were pillagers, they were marauders, and they would just come in and do what they want. And so when they saw this being redone, when they saw the work happening, they got a little upset because they realized it was going to affect their bottom line. And so they decide to try and hinder the work going on in Jerusalem. And do you know what the first tactic they used to stop the work was? It wasn't to come in and kill people. It wasn't to come in and show a force. They came in and made fun of them. That was the first thing they did. They came in to see what was going on, and they started to jeer them. They started to make fun of them. At one point, one guy says, look at this. Look what they built. If a fox jumped up on top of that, it'd fall down. And you may think, well, that's silly. But do you remember the first time you did something for someone and they didn't respond the way you hoped they would, and how that affected you? I remember the first time I loaded the dishwasher as a married man. And then my wife, she didn't say anything. She just came in and she started to redo it all, right? And so how did I respond, the good Christian husband that I am? Well, fine, I'm never doing it again. You don't care about my work. You don't care about anything I do. Nothing's ever good enough. How many times have you said or thought that, right? It crushes you. And if somebody makes fun of something you've done, I mean, gosh, do you remember the science project in like elementary and middle school? The stress that came with the judgment there? Like you walked in, if you've never heard Brian Regan, the comedian, talk about the science fair, you need to go home and YouTube it right now because he woke up and forgot that there was a science fair and he was supposed to have a project, and he got to school with his cup of dirt and he saw like other families like backing in a truck to pull projects off of the back of it. You know, he was just, it's really, really funny. You should listen to it. But do you remember that stress, the judgment? And that's what these guys did. And it started to work a little bit. Nehemiah had to kind of corral the people and started to say, hey, listen, you're doing a great job. You're doing great work. Don't stop what you're doing. Don't worry about what they say. Don't worry about what they may think. This is something important. And so the enemies of Jerusalem realized that wasn't going to work. So they started to change their tactics. And they started to plan an attack. These marauders, they started to work together and started to plan an attack. And the people in Jerusalem started to hear about it. And so how did Nehemiah respond to that? We see this in chapter 4 and verse 9. We see Nehemiah's response to a planned attack by a united enemy. This is how he first responded in chapter 4, verse 9 of Nehemiah. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. First response is prayer. Now, it's not just prayer. It's not standing in the middle of the road going, God, please don't let the car hit me. That's stupid. you pray for God's protection, and you move your feet, right? So that's what they did. They prayed that God was their protector, and they did everything on this side of heaven to prepare for what God only could do. We say that a lot in my house. We do everything this side of heaven. After having 2 girls, we did everything this side of heaven to have a boy. And there's actually a lot of things that you can do. We won't get into that right now, but we got a marriage series later on that we'll talk about that kind of stuff. But we did everything this side of heaven, trusting that only God would do what only God could do. And that's Nehemiah's response. And so the planned attack is thwarted, and they start to rumor. That's all they had to do. The enemy just started to send rumors about where the attack was going to happen. And so the people started freaking out. They started, hey, we're not safe. You can't go to work on the wall. You need to be home and protect us. Why? Well, I heard a rumor. You think, well, that's silly too. But ladies and gentlemen, Exhibit A, Facebook, and how powerful rumors are. Good grief. I mean, we literally have news programs running stories because they heard something on social media and then are having to retract it and do another story because what they heard wasn't true. That's the power of rumor. That's why you should be very, very careful about what you repeat, what you say to people. And it was happening in Jerusalem. The people were starting to step back from their work. And Nehemiah does something brilliant. It's one of my favorite moments in the story of Nehemiah. He takes some of the people of Jerusalem, and he takes them and puts a spear in their hand and a shield in their hand and a sword on their side. He puts women and children and workers in the low places of the wall, in the places where there was space left to be completed. And he brought the nobles, and he says, listen, if you won't do it for the sake of God and the sake of the city of Jerusalem, do it for And of course, like you would imagine, it rallied the people, and the work resumed, and they started working on the wall again. And like in my own life over the last couple of weeks, there was a real enemy at work here who didn't need a marauding group of bandits to attack. The next obstacle to the work of the wall in Jerusalem was not Sanballat and not any other group. It was actually from inside the people of Jerusalem. As people started to recognize that there was an opportunity, they started to leverage their positions and their authorities to make their life better while making it so much more difficult for the people that they were supposed to be leading. I know that's hard for us to imagine, that there would be leaders who leverage their position and authority to make life better for themselves while the people they're leading have a difficult time in life. I know we've never experienced anything like that in the United States. But that's what starts to happen. And Nehemiah squashes it. He calls them out. He goes on to show that he himself, who's in charge of this whole deal, is not even taking advantages of the things that the king has granted him. That he's living like a common guy. That he's not taking the provision of food that he's entitled to. His generosity sets a standard for leadership, sets a standard of example for everyone working on the wall. And the work resumes. So when the enemies of Jerusalem realize that all their other tactics haven't worked, they finally resign themselves to try and have a meeting with Nehemiah. And this happens in chapter 6. We see that Sanballat and Tobiah and these other guys, they're like, hey, Nehemiah, will you come and just meet with us? Maybe we can find a common solution, common ground to what's going on. And this Nehemiah's response is something I hope that is encouraging, as challenging as it is for me, for you as it is for me. This verse has become a mantra, a motto for my family. It's in different places in our house. It's become a motto for us as a church. And I love it. It's in chapter 6, verse 3. Nehemiah responds to the letters from Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem. And he says to them, he said, listen, I know you want to meet. And in verse 3, and I sent messengers to them saying, I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why shall the work stop while I leave it to come down to you? I don't know what you've got on your plate. I don't know if you're a husband, a father, a mother, a wife, a brother, a sister, a student, a business person, a banker, an at-home worker. I don't know what it is, but all of us carry with ourselves some level of responsibility. There's something that God has put in our paths to take care of. It may be schoolwork, it may be an individual, it may be caretaker for someone else. But we've all been given a responsibility. And I want you to hear this. That responsibility that God has given you is incredibly important. And there are going to be plenty of other things around you that are going to vie for your attention and your time. There are going to be things in your life, the people in your life, that are going to try to steal you away from the responsibility that God has placed in your hands. And you need to look at them, you need to look at those situations, and you need to remind yourself that I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. It may be raising children, it may be befriending someone, it may be pouring yourself into mission in this city or mission in another country. It may be being the best person in the office with compassion and excellence and whatever it is you do. You need to stop seeing your to-do lists as simply to-do lists and understand that they are responsibilities that have been entrusted to you from God on high. It's an opportunity for you to glorify him in them. So the work finally comes to a conclusion. And I think this is incredible. As I read this story and as I continue to read this story, I get to this point every time in chapter 6. And I honestly can't believe that this is the case, because you get down to verse 15 and it tells us about the end of the work of the wall. It says this in chapter 6, verse 15. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month Elul in 52 days. All this happened in less than 2 months. Like, I don't know about you, but when I read this story, I picture years going by. It all happened in 52 days. And I love this story, but it's completely unnecessary. Because if you look at the life of Nehemiah, it doesn't make sense. Why would Nehemiah leave the comfort of the palace and step into the mess of Jerusalem? Because he's Jewish? It still doesn't make sense. He has it made. Unless you think about the only reason why it does make sense. For the glory of God. Nehemiah understood that at that time in history, the presence of God was in the place of God's people. And as long as the city of God's people was in danger, that the presence of God was not fully on display. The story of Nehemiah's compassion, his desire to seek the welfare of the people of Jerusalem, reveals the character of God himself. In John 3:16, you might be familiar with that verse. It's the most famous verse in all the world. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life." It continues in verse 17. We shouldn't just stop at 16. "For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him." Jesus Christ stepped out of the comfort of heaven and stepped into the mess of your world to put his Father's glory on display. And we claim that we live lives to glorify God, but I'm just struggling. I'm struggling with this. God has been burdening my heart, and I told you that I was stressed out as your pastor, and it's this expectation that I put on myself. And honestly, the thing that I'm most worried about right now is that I'm leading a group of people, and I'm not leading you enough into dependency on God. Because if what we call Christianity is simply showing up for an hour on Sunday and saying, hey, sport, hey, tiger, oh, your hair looks cute. Where'd you get those shoes? That's not Christianity. Jesus stepped out of heaven and stepped into our mess, and he tells us in John chapter 10 exactly why he did it. In John chapter 10, verses 10 and 11, he says this. He says this. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He laid down his life for us, for you, for me, for our church, for the churches in our city, for the world. In Luke chapter 19, verse 10, Jesus says, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. I've never been in this situation where my child was legitimately lost. There's one time when Savannah Grace was very young, we were at the Georgia Aquarium in Atlanta, and they had this slide. And as a new parent, I didn't think through the whole situation. I think Anita was in the bathroom with Riley as a baby, and I was with Savannah, and she wanted to go down this slide, and so I'm up there standing in line with her, and it's like this 2-story slide. And she slides down the slide, and I'm at the top up there, and I see my daughter alone. I mean, alone. There's no Georgia Aquarium person at the bottom of the slide. It's just a mass of people, and this fear overcame me, and this is what I did. I took this rather jiggly toddler boy. I literally picked him up and moved him aside and threw myself down that slide as fast as I possibly could. Because if my child was lost, there was nothing that was going to stand in the way of me getting to her. Church, if that doesn't weigh on you that that's what Jesus did, then we have a problem. And it doesn't weigh on us like it should. And do you know why? Because we think too lightly of our sin. We are not burdened. We are not sad about our sin. Do you know why it took Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem? Because the people who lived there had grown comfortable with the squalor and the fear. Our church has grown comfortable with the squalor of our sin. We're not praying and we're not fasting. We're not devoting ourselves to the mission of God. In 2 weeks, we're going to put this big pool right here. And we're going to celebrate life change. We're going to celebrate people professing Jesus publicly through baptism. And as excited as I am about that, I'm burdened by the conditions that we've created. Because we practically have to talk people into it. Some people don't want to be baptized because they're introverted. Holy crap. Get over yourself. Some people don't want to be baptized because they were baptized as a baby. Listen, I hear that. I understand that. I'm not trying to take anything away from that family experience and what that meant to your family and meant to you. But listen, the God of heaven sent his son to die on a cross for our sins. For every time you speed, there was a stripe on his back. For every time that you lied or cheated or stole, there's a stripe on his back. Flesh was torn from his side for our sin. And the only thing he asks in response to surrendering to that kind of love is that we stand up publicly before our people, before his people, and say that he's changed my life. Yet we've got to make sure it fits into our calendar. listen, if you're a Christian, and if you're not a Christian, then man, this isn't about you. But if you're a believer in Jesus, if you have ever claimed that you've been changed by God and you've surrendered your life to him, the only biblically prescribed way to publicly profess him as your Lord is through baptism. We shouldn't have to talk you into it. You should be jumping into the freaking pool. I've been changed. My life has been made new. But we're so comfortable in the broken down walls of Jerusalem that we look at that and think, it's just not for me. I'm burdened as your pastor because I think we just have made it far too easy for you to live in the broken down city of Jerusalem. And this isn't because we need more people to give. This isn't because we need more volunteers anywhere. This isn't because we want to bump up our baptism numbers. I want you to respond to Jesus. Last night I couldn't sleep very well. Apart from the time change, I was restless. And I found myself praying for as many of you as possible by name. I fell asleep probably 4 or 5 times praying for you by name as much as I could because I'm so burdened by the possibility that I've not made it clear to you that it's not okay to have a mediocre walk with Jesus. Your sin isn't okay. Your selfishness isn't okay. Yes, Jesus loves you, but he has so much more in store for you. He wants to rebuild the walls of your city. He wants to restore the beauty to your home. He wants to renew relationships and friendships. He has so much better for you, but we're settling for the broken down city of Jerusalem. There are people here in this room and outside those walls that don't know the truth of Jesus, and those of us who do are wasting the message. How will you respond to the God of heaven who stepped out of perfection and stepped into the mess of your world to fix it, to redeem it, to love you, and to glorify his Father? I don't know if I'm just tired or Irish, but I'm struggling with where we are, what we're calling ourselves to. It's just not good enough to fill a room while people die and go to hell. My biggest fear is that far too many people sit in rooms like this on Sundays like this with the false sense of security that they are Christians and they could not be farther from Christ. You might know a lot about Jesus, but if he hasn't changed your heart, it doesn't matter. And if he's changed your heart, then it should show in your actions. You should look around and see, we got to fix the gate. We got to rebuild the wall. We got to put God's glory on display. And so to end our time today, I want you to respond. I don't want you to come up here and stand on the mic and tell us your secret sin. Tell God. You don't even have to come down here and kneel at these steps. All of that is fine. If you want to do that, you can't have the microphone. But if you want to do any of that stuff, that's fine. If you want to come pray with me, that's fine. But that's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to respond to Jesus today. Is he calling you to let go of some stuff in your life? Is he calling you to go with us to Haiti in August? or to give money to an organization that needs it, or to step up and volunteer? Is he calling you to profess him publicly before people in 2 weeks through baptism? What is he calling you to? How have you grown comfortable in the broken down city of Jerusalem? And what is God asking you to do? How will you respond today? And so Jordan's gonna come, he's gonna play on the guitar, because you guys are miserable when it's just silent and we're praying. I got in trouble for that a few times, that nobody was playing music while we prayed because you're uncomfortable. So I'm going to make it comfortable for you while we uncomfortably pray. Okay? And listen, if you want to come pray with me, that's fine. I'm not asking you to. You can. But I want you just where you are, privately, personally, honestly, if you're not a Christian and you feel like God's calling you to respond to him today, then do that. Move, do something. Take a step in your faith with Jesus today. I'm going to close this in prayer at the end of this time. But right now, just close your eyes, bow your heads, don't pay attention to anyone else around you, and respond to Jesus today.